Welcome to Encounter Grace, where we help thinking Christians think clearly. I'm Jason McKnight, and I'm glad you're here. In the last 10 weeks, the global economy has been set on edge with tariffs and no tariffs and reciprocal tariffs and 75 nations negotiating and China doubling down and stock markets up and down and down and up. And the whole apple cart seems to have been upset. Is it for good? Is it for ill? Short-term pain? Is it going to bring long-term pain? Meanwhile, what's going on in other countries? How are others responding to this on the political level, on the individual level, and then most importantly of all for believers, how do our brothers and sisters in other countries navigate these days with a gospel worldview? Well, to help us answer some of these questions, at least for one nation, we're pleased and honored to have Ray Pennings with us. Ray is Executive Vice President and co-founder of Cardus, a leading Canadian think tank and the publisher of Comment magazine. He has worked extensively in politics and punditry, published in several areas, education, law, theology, and he speaks and writes widely. And I love every Saturday to get his weekly newsletter, which is called Cardus Insights. Ray, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I cannot wait to dive into a good conversation with you about some of these things in the introduction, Trump and Trudeau and trolling and tariffs. I had to get all the T's in there. But then also Canada is in the middle of an election, and this is going to go out just about 5 days before the election's over. And then I'd love to talk about what is a think tank and how does that help in public life. And then finally, maybe we'll talk a little bit about the hope that you kind of have for Canada and for the U.S. and for the church. So we're just trying to help thinking Christians think clearly here. So if that's okay with you.
Sounds like a plan.
Excellent. Well, all right. So I grew up in Montreal. You're coming to us from Ottawa, which are just about 90 miles apart. And Canada and the U.S. have historically been closest of friends, at least over the last 100 years, a 5,000-mile undefended border, 1965 or something like that, the integrated auto industry. So for 60 years, basically one country in terms of an auto industry, partnerships around the world working and fighting for freedom and democracy in many places. And yet, 2025, Canada's been on the hot seat from the White House, not America, but the White House like never before. We all remember Trump trolling Trudeau, calling him governor and tweaking him about making Canada the 51st state. And not just, I don't know if Americans realize this, but not just tweaking him, but tweaking an entire country. That doesn't sound like the words of a safe and a known and a maybe even loving neighbor. But did it accomplish anything? What do we think about all that if we're coming at us from north of the border?
Well, a couple of things. You're very right. Were we doing this interview 5 months ago? We would have framed the Canada-U.S. relationship in an entirely different vein. Closest friends, allies. We fought together in wars. 9/11 happened. American planes couldn't land. They all landed in Canada, and all sorts of wonderful feel-good stories. I will say that if President Trump has accomplished anything in Canada, he has united Canadians as never before, but probably with a certain anti-American sentiment that is fairly strong and pronounced right across the political spectrum. So right now, we have an election campaign, and the number one issue in the election campaign is who is best able to deal with President Trump and the White House and a renewed economic and security arrangement. And the irony is that campaign will probably have, if the polls presently, and we're recording this 2 weeks in advance of the campaign, and the debate, which, as you know, in the U.S., if I recall, things were on a certain trajectory, and then the debate happened, and things changed.
June 2024.
So we are recording things before the debate, which will happen in 2 days. We have 2 debates in Canada, one in French and one in English. So they're going to happen in just a couple of days. But let's assume nothing dramatic happens. Most likely, we are going to elect a fairly progressive government that has a policy agenda that I suspect is about the opposite of much of what President Trump advocates. So, ironically, if standing for some of those things is what he's seeking, he's actually going to achieve much of the opposite in Canada.
Yeah, so the polls are showing the Liberal Party in Canada. Now, it's amazing. In Canada, we just name them liberal and conservative parties.
Correct.
So you don't have to do any thinking. So the Liberal Party, which is currently in power, they're expected to win again according to the polls. Is that correct?
That is correct. Now, I will highlight the Conservative Party. So just very quick, assuming not all of your listeners keep up to Canadian politics on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
We've had 10 years of Prime Minister Trudeau, who has been the leader of the Liberal Party. Over the course of the last year, his popularity has gone down to historic lows, to the point where his party basically in December, the finance minister resigned, and basically his own party kicked him out, and they elected a new leader very last minute. And so the former governor of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney, has been elected leader in the Canadian system. He actually is the prime minister legally. And then after being the prime minister for 5 days, an election was called. And so we are now in the middle of a 37-day election campaign, and on April the 28th, we will elect a new parliament. In Canada, we do not elect prime ministers. We elect parliaments. And the person who is perceived to have the confidence of the House, which needs to be tested with actual votes, is the person who gets invited to form the government. So right now, if all the polls would unfold, Prime Minister Carney would be expected to stay there. When he started, the Conservatives were 25 points ahead. Now the Conservatives are about 10 points behind. So we have seen in 3 months, depending which poll and how you ask the questions, but 25 to 30 point swing in the polls. Ironically, we do have a third party in Canada, which historically, it's basically a socialist party, the New Democratic Party. Yep. Historically, it usually got in double digits, somewhere around 15%. They have fallen significantly, and all of that vote seems to have gone to the Liberals. So it isn't entirely a collapse of the Conservatives. Conservatives continue to be fairly high in the polls, but all of the vote has remaining vote has coalesced to the Liberals, and that's where we sit as we record this.
Which seems to hand them an election. But as you say, a debate can change everything.
And I would remind, while that Mr. Carney has never been elected to office before, while he has a bit of a profile as the governor of the Bank of Canada, that is probably a little more among elite levels, those who follow politics and business. The ordinary Canadian was just introduced to Mr. Carney, and while right now they have sort of flocked to him, it's a very thin, it's not a deep support, and it may very well change yet before Election Day.
Yeah, that's right. Tell me, as an outside observer, let's shift away from Canada for a second, and what we get to do, as I grew up in Canada as Canadians, is we get to know a lot about the U.S. We get to know because 10 times as many people, it's our largest trading partner, so on and so forth. What have you watched over the last 10 years in this Make America Great Again, this MAGA movement? What do you see that's good in it? What do you see that's dangerous in it as a believer on the outside?
A couple of things. First of all, I'm of the school very much that the MAGA movement didn't change things, it exposed things. So I think there was a disconnect between the elites who were leading government and rank and file Americans, and there was a frustration with the system not being attentive and not listening to their needs and being driven by certain agendas. And whatever you want to say about President Trump, he is a brilliant marketer, but he also has a keen eye or ear to the ground, and I think he managed to capture that. And the very fact that most of the elite institutions did not capture that and were as surprised as they were, I think speaks very much to to something that already was there on the ground. So I don't think this is just the last 10 years. I think it's a much longer trajectory, and it has been given political expression through President Trump and the MAGA movement. The second thing I would observe is it is a very clear movement in terms of what it's against: drain the swamp, dodge, cutting things, anti-woke. There are a whole pile of things that it's very clear to break down, and there is disruption needed in every political system from time to time, and many of those things I wholeheartedly agree. However, I do caution that governing is also about building and keeping people together, and there are a whole number of biblical principles that come, which is not just destroying the bad, but it's also building the good. And the third thing I think there's something to be concerned about some of those things as it relates to the movement. The third is that from a Christian witness in society, politics is not ultimate. And one has to, as we conduct ourselves in public life, it's a bully pulpit, it's a modeling, leadership has followers. And I will simply say, as a Christian, I'll just take the most recent Republican convention. I found it quite startling and hard to understand exactly how you had a former porn star speaking, followed by prayer by Franklin Graham, followed by a WWE wrestler with all that bravado, and then the president coming and in a single sentence describing how he appreciated all of them and somehow they cohered. I will confess that I have a little difficulty adding all of those things together.
Mm-hmm. But as you say, he's a marketer.
He's a marketer.
Yeah, it's. I think a lot of us are interested to consider fully what is. See, so also the MAGA movement may not be exactly overlapping with what Trump's doing. Like there's these hearts that people have to, this is our home. Of course, we want to make America great again, or make my home great again, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that everything Trump does is in line with what every person there thinks.
I would say, as a Canadian observing, obviously right now we're in the midst of the tariff war and going back. I would say that, the jokes about the 51st state and all the rest, one can take them for whatever they are. I think when you attack people's sovereignty, and he went beyond those jokes, he actually has talked about economically destroying Canada with an eye to our natural resources and our minerals. I would say, that frankly, that's offensive. Mm-hmm. As a Canadian, I'm a friend. I think America is one of the greatest countries in history, and I have a lot of appreciation for the United States of America, and I respect your sovereignty. That's part of the whole thing. I may not like some of the tariff moves, and actually I think some of them are economically foolish, and I think the stock markets and the bond markets are having something of a say about that. Yeah. But I fully respect, and I have worked in public policy and minored in economics for 30 years. I'm reasonably literate. I don't think it's going to accomplish exactly what President Trump, and I'm with the majority of economists in saying that. However, one cannot deny the fact that President Trump, in the campaign, tariff is the most beautiful word. Yep. He clearly telegraphed what he wants to do. And as a sovereign country, the United States elected a president, and he has every right to do what he is doing. I have no difficulty with that, and whether or not how that impacts Canada is of secondary impact. But this is where I come to, when I talk about Christians, politics and everything else, I take offense to President Trump having put tariffs, and he did in his first term as well as now, on Canadian steel outside of the agreement, in violation of a trade agreement he himself signed. And when Congress is, under a security provision of fentanyl, well, less than 1% of the fentanyl coming into the United States comes from Canada. That's U.S. statistics, not Canadian statistics. When you take your signed agreements, which when he signed it in 2018, he called it the best agreement ever signed in the world, and it has his signature on the bottom, and now he's basically violating his own agreements. There's something the Bible says about bearing false witness and letting your yea be yea and your nay be nay. And, sure, that can be rational. I hear lots of rationalizations, but from a Christian perspective, when we start breaking our word, there are provisions in that agreement to open the agreement up and renegotiate it, by all means. The U.S. is entirely within its right to do it. I would argue when you do it by not respecting your own agreements and making a pretense, and when Congress last week was doing it, he attempted to bully them, and basically they were calling him out on it, and he was, trying to get Congress to certify his false witness. Those are pretty fundamental issues that Christians need to think about in terms of how we deal with each other in the public square.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because it is easy to see, let's stick it to the elites, and finally the regular people are having it. But word is bond. Your signature is your bond, and as you point out, in 2018, the USMCA was signed by this president, and that matters. And so the amendment process from within ought to be followed, or at least telegraphed, and not just cut away.
And if we, the questions being asked by some in the, so we're gonna negotiate a new USMCA or son of USMCA, whatever it's going to be called after this election. How do we know, even if we sign it in the summer, that in the fall somebody won't change their mind?
Right.
Is it actually worth? Is the U.S. a reliable partner?
Yeah, that's what happens. That's exactly the next question. Yeah. Is it a reliable partner? Is the word that they give, which then carries over economically into are people going to buy T-bills anymore? Are their bonds going to be worth any? That's the next thing which people aren't thinking about right now, but a year from now or 2 years from now, depending.
But I think with the 90-day pause on the tariffs last week was interesting. President Trump anticipated, and the fact that the stock markets would have a short-term adjustment and all the rest, and we had record declines. He was prepared to see that through. The irony is, I don't think what he counted on was the bond markets. There's suddenly being a rush on selling U.S. bills, and the U.S. is used to being sort of the reserve currency of the world.
Right.
And essentially, what was happening is the rest of the world was saying, with this behavior, we're not so sure we want U.S. currency, and there was a bit of sell-off on bonds, which he had to put the 90-day pause on, largely because the U.S. dollar was taking a bit of a tumble.
Yep, that's right. I mean, it's fascinating. We are living in interesting times, which is that ancient curse. May you be cursed with living in interesting times. In terms of one last question here on Trump, you said never have Canadians been as patriotic as now, at least never in the last 50 years, let's say. So then ultimately, was that a bit of bad medicine or a bit of good medicine that tasted bad?
I have said in many settings that this has been a wake-up call for Canada, and some difficult questions that we should have been dealing with, and some of us have been advocating for the last decade or so, or 2 decades, in terms of our own defense spending, in terms of interprovincial trade barriers, in terms of diversifying our trade. 77% of Canadian trade goes to the United States. We've had issues with our environmentalists and how to deal with getting our oil to sea. The irony is, it is exposing for most Canadians something that some of us have been saying for some time. If we wanted to counter tariff by cutting off the oil supply to the U.S. from Alberta, the challenge is that we would also cut it off to our eastern provinces, because the only way the oil gets to eastern Canada is through the United States. We are that integrated in terms of a pipeline. So, we haven't given ourselves a strong negotiating hand, and that's on Canada. That is, and it is forcing the discussion of certain issues now that we need to deal with ourselves. So insofar as Canadians didn't listen to Canadian politicians, but the crisis created by President Trump have caused them to take a second look at some things, I suppose we should say thank you.
That's very gracious. Well, let's turn to let's just turn again to the Canadian election. So we've talked about Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of Canada, which then went over to England and now is running. And he is the prime minister and is running in the Liberal Party. The guy who's been running on the Conservative Party side, named Pierre Poilievre, he's got quite a following. It doesn't seem like, at least 10 days out or 12 days out, it doesn't seem like enough to get elected. But what do you see that he's done in terms of the Canadian conversation over the last 5 or 7 years?
Well, he got elected 3 years ago as the leader of the Conservative Party, but he's been a member of Parliament for 2 decades. So I think he was the youngest elected member. He was in his early 20s when he became elected. He is one of the most skilled communicators that we've had in Canadian politics in quite some time. He's very quick on his feet. Yeah. And, some of your listeners may have seen it was an interview that went viral in which he's at an orchard chomping on an apple and engaging with a journalist who is making various questions based on dubious premises, and he's calling him out in somewhat of an entertaining manner. He is very skilled in all of that. He would be probably sort of a libertarian, a classical liberal in his own philosophy. At a personal level, he's pro-choice. He has quite the personal story. He was born to a single mother, adopted by parents. Actually, his mother, when he was a teenager, was a regular Mass attending Catholic, if I understand correctly, took him to pro-life meetings, got involved in politics very early. He's not particularly religious himself along the way, but certainly classic libertarian, and has made a bit of a point in terms of sort of being anti-woke on a number of those issues, although his critics would say inconsistently so. Those are the realities of Canadian politics as well. I think for those who don't know Canada, we are much more like Europe than we are the United States. 12% of Canadians attend church on a weekly basis compared to 36% or so of Americans. Interestingly, on our politics, the rule of thumb is that the entire spectrum's a little more left. Obviously, we have socialized Medicare in this country, and that's a no-go zone for even conservatives, pretty well right across the spectrum. A single-payer healthcare system. There's a lot of debate about our healthcare. But we would look to Europe as the model for a lot of this, as opposed to the U.S. So sometimes Americans just want to transpose their system to Canada. But number one, our electoral system is very different in terms of how we elect parliaments and prime ministers and how they're chosen. And secondly, the political culture is very, very different as well.
Well, let's talk about the new polling that came out, which was in part authorized by Cardus in
more than authorized. It was paid for by Cartis.
There we go, paid for.
I know a thing or two because it's a 10,000 person poll, 5,000 Americans and 5,000 Canadians. Does not come cheap, but it's our 25th anniversary, and we wanted to do a deep dive into some stuff. So, we're privileged to have our hands on this data, most of which is not yet public, but we did tease out a few things last week.
I mean, that was fascinating. Talk to us a little bit about the powerlessness feeling in both countries.
Yeah, we asked a number of questions. I would actually start by, first of all, the polarization that is there. So we asked in Canada, U.S. audience, let me just start with that. We asked all Democrat supporters whether to respond to the Democratic Party as a threat to America's well-being, and then we did the same for the Republican Party, for all those who do not vote. So remember, we're asking people who do not vote for the party. We're trying to get a sense of how intensely and how dangerous. Do you just disagree with the other party, or do you see them as a threat? What's interesting in the U.S., 68% of non-Democrats see the Democratic Party as a threat. 75% of non-Republicans see the Republican Party as a threat. So
as a threat, not just that I disagree with it, but that it's a threat to the well-being.
It's a threat to the well-being of your country. So what you have is tremendous polarization in which the neighbors you politically disagree with are no longer your neighbors. They're actually a threat to the country. Traitor is perhaps a time, we didn't use that word, but there is a sense of loyalty being questioned along the way. We asked about a number of institutions and trust in institutions. And, there's nothing new here. Trust is going down in every institution, and there's not a lot of trust that people have in institutions. What I found interesting is the Americans' trust in various large tech companies. So Americans have way more trust in organized religion. They also have much more trust in business. Only 12% of Canadians say they have confidence in large tech companies. 31% of Americans do. So there is a different institutional sort of trust that does exist as we look. And then we asked the question, and this is you had to pick, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree. So and the statement we had is, it's impossible for people like me to have any real influence on the political decisions that affect me. What is interesting is 57% of Americans agree or strongly agree with that statement. 63% of Canadians. So there's a little more sense of agency, but in both countries, I think the story is the lack of agency that people are feeling right across the board. In terms of the strongly disagree, only 10% of Canadians, only 12% of Americans basically, are saying that, I'm able to have influence on the political process. So they see politics as something that is done to them, not by them. And they see those who disagree with them as somehow at fault and endangering their country and their way of life. That's the context in which we are living. And one of the things that at the heart of this poll, and we haven't released this publicly, but since 2017 in Canada, we have been doing a fairly deep dive in terms of how people's faith impacts their public life. So a lot of polls just have you check the box. So I'm Catholic, I'm Protestant, I'm Baptist, whatever. We have that, but then we ask 7 questions that we embed alongside, your age group, your income, urban, rural, where you live. We ask 7 questions on every one of our polls. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in an afterlife? Have you had a religious experience or an encounter with God? Do you educate your children according to a religious or moral code? Do you read a sacred text? Do you pray? And do you attend a place of worship? If you do 6 or 7 of those things, we call you religiously committed. So you are not just checking the box, you're actually behaving in a way that reflects religion as important in your life. 16%, 16% of Canadians over time have shown that. So this poll is going to allow us to do a deep dive and create that spectrum of spirituality. We haven't released all of this. At a top level, the U.S. number is close to double that in terms of religious commitment. So in very broad terms, if you have to divide, so we have 4 categories. So let's just take the 2 on the religious side. So these are people who check the box. They don't necessarily go to church, but they would call on a weekly basis, but they would they would say they believe in God, they would educate their children, they would call themselves, in most cases, a Christian, given the fact we're in North America, although we ask, regardless of faith background. What is interesting in Canada, it's roughly 35% that are somewhat religious and 65% on the non-religious side. And in the U.S., it's almost inverted. So in the U.S., you have sort of 60+% of the population living in some way where religion is some part of their life. So they're doing at least 4 of the 7 things that I mentioned. So they, whereas so it's a very different culture in terms of the place of faith in the culture. And we're planning to, stay tuned throughout the year. We're going to do a deep dive in terms of how each of these 4 groups interact differently in terms of volunteering, charitable giving, voting, view of neighbor, view of self, and really trying to understand better how faith interacts with public life.
That's fascinating. Did that surprise you that it was 16% of Canadians religiously committed?
Well, we've been doing this since 2017. So I've done 19 polls, I believe, since 2017, and this is now embedded in every one of our polls. So, and that number has been a bit, but we've been roughly within the margin of error. It really hasn't, I don't think it's ever been higher than 19. So between 16 and 19%. And I think, one of our motives, we launched this, we did a one-off poll in 2017, which was Canada's 150th anniversary. Right. And we did a study, on the story of faith in Canadian public life. Because it's kind of interesting. Faith is sort of at the heart of Canada's history. If we follow through, of course, the French sort of came in the late 17th century, beginning of the 18th century into Canada, and you sort of had the French-English wars, and that sort of got resolved in the middle of the 19th century. French Catholics and English Protestants were having all their skirmishes here, just like England and France were across the pond. Essentially, 3 things came together in the mid-1800s. One was Canadians were sort of sick and tired of fighting the wars abroad and not focusing on the issues here. Number 2, the Americans were in the midst of their own civil war, and Canada did not want to get drawn into that. The Canadians, whatever they thought about each other, they knew they were not American and had made various choices. And then there was the challenges with the indigenous people. So in many ways, whereas America was founded by a revolution and, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Canada is a peace treaty between French Catholics and English Protestants. And you'll see in the Constitution, for example, the guarantee of minority rights. So the French promised the English, you can have Protestant school, you can educate your children according, and vice versa. So those protections are built into the constitutional structure. Our objective is peace, order, and good government, living with our differences alongside each other. So it's a very different ethos that has shaped even the political culture of the country.
Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, peace, order, and good government as sort of animating principles. And you can see the story behind each of them. It's fascinating to have it laid out just so clearly right here.
Yeah, and so, as I said, right now, Canadians tend to know, when your U.S. presidential debates are on live Canadian TV. Election night in the U.S., we watch. Why? Yeah. Well, 77% of our exports go to the United States. We are, the Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, the father of Justin, who was our Prime Minister in the 70s, always joked that when you're a mouse sleeping with the elephant, you always are careful when the elephant rolls over to make sure that you don't get smothered.
That's right.
The reality is we're about 10% of the size of the United States with 40 million people, and you're just shy of 400 million. We're basically the size of California.
Yeah.
Except we have a huge landmass, and we have many of the largest energy reserves in the world, not just oil and gas, where I think we are the third largest or second largest reserve in the world, but essential minerals, uranium, and many of these other minerals that are necessary, on which, we have, and one of the reasons we have a free trade agreement with the United States, contrary to some of the assertions, and I understand we need to take President Trump in terms of, he's the art of the deal and a negotiator, and there's an element of bluff and all the rest in what he says. We don't need to take it all literally, but at the same time, when the United States says they don't need Canada, well, actually, I suspect if we close that border entirely, there would be lots of things that are essential, including, from what I understand, a lot of the ingredients in terms of your drug, the isotopes used in cancer treatment, which exclusively come to Canada, not to mention a significant amount of your energy. So, the joke has always been, apparently, Eastern Seaboard, I don't know the exact percentage, but the electricity comes from Quebec primarily into New York. We're one of the major suppliers. So
and New England, Maine, and
New
New
England.
Hampshire.
So one of our former Prime Minister Chrétien joked in the middle of the trade dispute that we just need to find out which weekend President Trump is at his New York place, and all we have to do is cut off the hydro on that Sunday afternoon, because he'll only walk the 67 flights of stairs once. And so anyway, all of that, we can joke about it a little bit. I guess the point I want to make is there's a reason that the U.S. entered into this deal, because there are things that the U.S. needs from Canada as well. This isn't just a one-sided relationship.
Right. But in the bluster and the art of the deal, you make it one-sided. You make it look that way. And of course, when you stop to think about it, and if people do stop to think about it, they see that. They see the mutuality there. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't stop to think about it. They just read the headline and move on.
And that's where, we're on a Christian podcast here. And I would say that one of the responsibilities of Christian citizenship is actually to be truthful in your negotiations and in your dealings, not just as individuals, but as a country. A business that does not treat its customers well, even if the owner goes to church, we would say it's not a very good Christian business. Mm-hmm. And I have written, you mentioned my weekly newsletter, I have written that as idealistic and as inspiring as I find many of the things the United States stand for, its dealings over the last 6 months have fallen far short of its values in terms of how it has gone about it.
Yeah, I think there's some real truth in that. Let me shift us to Cardus itself, to the work you do and why you do it. What on earth does a think tank do, and what's it there for?
So the easiest way is just let me autobiographically just tell you how it started. I'm the co-founder of Cartis. I got involved in politics in my teens. Was involved in my first campaign when I was 14. I managed my first campaign when I was 18. So worked in the back rooms of politics at a secondary level. I by no means was one of the main players, but I was also a little higher than just a local player as well. After doing that for about 15 years, while working, my full-time occupation actually was in labor relations, but after doing that for 15 years, successfully electing a good number of Christians to office at municipal, provincial, and federal levels, increasingly became a bit disillusioned. Maybe that was just the idealism of my teens and 20s. I was now a father and in my 30s, and looking at all of this and wondering, did it really make a difference? Sending Christians to elected office, did it make a difference? And became aware of the fact that the Christian community, I don't want to say it's easy to motivate, it's hard work, but you can get people during an election campaign to write a check, to put a sign in their front yard, to get out, knock on their neighbors' doors. You could activate the Christian community. And because of our thick social networks, in a time of declining religious attendance, generally those who do attend and have significant networks actually can have a disproportional influence. And, I think you see that in the United States as well. We certainly saw that in Canada. I have often joked and it's a joke, but it's also, I think, objectively true. In the Canadian Parliament, the most overrepresented groups are evangelicals and the LGBTQ community. And why is that in part? Well, that is because they have thick networks outside that can be leveraged for political advantage in short-term campaigns. But electing people to office is not the point. The point is you want to see policies and governance happen according to Christian principles. And what we found is we were not equipping those who were elected to office with sound data, with research, and all the rest. So in 2000, I ran for office myself. The voters, about 2,000 votes short of being elected to the Canadian Parliament. And so I always joke Cardus is the consolation prize. So we started the think tank. And together with Michael Van Pelt, my university friend who actually was working in the business community, had been a municipal councillor. And so we started together in 2000. So really a think tank does three things. One, we collect data and do research. So we collect data. I mentioned the poll. We've been very active on the euthanasia file, on family, on education. So we collect data that nobody else is collecting, so that we have, when you're in the public square, data is the currency of public opinion. You may have your opinion, and I may have, what's the Jim Barksworth quote? You have, if you have data, bring it to the table. If you have opinions, we're going with mine. Well, let's, if we're not in power, let's at least have some data we can bring to the table. Secondly, it is about creating vocabulary and arguments that people can use. So we have, ironically, and I don't know the United States well enough, I know in Canada, for example, gambling. Government has a real addiction to gambling revenue. Sports, you can't watch a sports event without, the parlays on this, that, the other being flooded endlessly along the way. The irony is it's actually conservative governments that have led the way in terms of, the left actually has probably a little more of a social conscience when it comes to the dangers of gambling. But the reality is that, 1 out of 13 people in Canada is using grocery money, renter grocery money.
Wow.
So, I always say, well, that, people say, well, that's not me. I don't gamble. Well, no, but 1 out of 13 people, go down your street, count 13 houses. One of them, your neighbors, there's a kid going hungry. The social consequences of this are huge.
Right.
So we have led the way on that, so a whole range of issues that we have led the way in collecting data, creating arguments, and thirdly, convening. We have, in the office that I'm sitting in here, event space. I'm 3 doors down for the Canadian Parliament. We held over 50 events last year in this space. We've had almost half of the members of Parliament have attended one or other, and we do so right across the spectrum. Our tagline is, this is the living room of Canada to have the conversations you can't have on Twitter. We invite people we disagree with. As a matter of fact, the last major interview that Mr. Carney did before he announced his leadership was an hour-and-a-half fireside chat here at Cartis in November. So we bring people from right across the spectrum, engage in conversations, and in a way that explicitly is willing to talk about the role that our core beliefs, our faith, informs our public life. Mm-hmm. So we've been blessed. It's our 25th anniversary. And in the U.S., we actually publish a magazine. They're both cross-border, but Comment Magazine is actually, Ann Snyder is based in Washington, and she's the editor of Comment Magazine. CommentMagazine.org is the website. And it's a quarterly, beautiful print magazine. We have 3 podcasts. So there's a whole range of resources. We describe ourselves as a Canadian think tank operating in the North American space with a global reach.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Tell us the website again. Commentmagazine.org for the
Commentmagazine.org is comment, and then Cardus.ca is the Cardus website. And there if you go to Cardus.ca, you can see everything, and there's a link to comment there as well. So if you're only going to write down one thing, Cardus, Cardus.ca.
And by the way, what does Cardus mean?
Well, it's actually interesting. Originally, when we started, we were called the Work Research Foundation because we started in the area of economics. Discovered the fact that number one, we were growing past economics, and secondly, the word foundation in our title had many people thinking we had money, whereas we actually were a charity that needed money. So we rebranded in 2008. And we struggled to find the right name and went back and forth. Cartis is actually a made-up word. So it's just like Nike. We thought we'd make up a word and we would become it. But its roots are actually the Cardo Maximus, which is the Latin name for a north-south street in an ancient Roman city. So sort of like the Greek agora. Agora is sort of the square in which the university, the town hall, the church, everything is on that square. Well, the Cardo Maximus is the main street in which all the institutions of society are there. It also, of course, reminds people of cardio, heart. So it had a number of annotations, but the truth be told, we made it up.
I like that one. That's the best. Well, Ray, the time is getting away from us, but I'm enjoying this conversation and being stimulated by it. But I want us to turn to the future here, just to think forwardly. And I want us to turn, because the gospel always has to turn us to hope. So as you consider the Canadian context, the Canadian church, what you're seeing, the work of Cardus, what gives you hope right now? And then if I could, as you consider what's going on in the U.S. and the American church and the friends you have here in the U.S., what gives you hope there?
Yeah, can I answer the question as opposed to the Canada-U.S. distinction?
Sure.
Maybe I'm just being Canadian and don't, I always, whenever I give speeches in the U.S., I always joke I'm Canadian, not Russian, so I'm not going to try to influence your election. And frankly, I'm not sure right now. I say this in ducking the question in part because I'm not sure there is a single U.S. right now. I think, frankly, if I'm speaking to Eastern Seaboard Christians, or I'm speaking to Southern, or the Midwest, or the West Coast, I observe very different things, and I'm not ready to. I don't want to pretend to understand things that I just know aren't there. But I think there is a zeitgeist that doesn't respect the 49th parallel that affects us all on either side of the border, and I'll give you Canadian numbers because I know them, but I get the sense that similar trends are happening. So first of all, in terms of hope, I look at the fact that whereas in Canada, 12% of Canadians attended a place of church last week, 18% of those under the age of 30 attended church. 1.5 times.
Yeah.
There is a bit of a resurgence. So frankly, if I can just speak in crass terms, and this needs nuance, but it's just easier to, baby boomers are our problem. They rejected religion, and they have turned their kids against religion.
I can't wait to tell my sister she's the problem.
There is, and I say this, I'm born in 1966, and my definition of baby boomers are those born in between 45 and 65. So I'm a post-boomer, but barely. But no, the reality is we have an entire generation, and we released a report today in Canada in terms of social isolation and connectedness. The breakdown of the family, the breakdown, not going to church, combine that with the rise of technology, the cell phone, everything else. People do not have the relation. They're lonely. So, there are a lot of problems. Part of that, so you see the attraction. We talk politically in terms of how a lot of, especially young men, are appealing to, the MAGA movement and Trump. Why? Because they're pointing a vision. We can, make America great again, right? There's a way forward. Now, they may not provide the path it's interesting. Jordan Peterson's a Canadian who has attracted a lot of that, and the irony is he uses a lot of biblical language and everything else, but yet his message at the core is about self-sacrifice and merit. It's not the gospel. You have to find the answer within yourself. Well, to that I say, I have good news. The gospel is the fact that the problems may be in society and inside yourself, but there's hope that this world has a purpose beyond me. And that's, it's not my fulfillment. It's not my autonomy. That's not what gives meaning and hope. No, there's a far bigger and a far more beautiful picture that is painted. And part of it is I'm an image bearer of a triune God, a God who is three persons in relationship with each other. I'm created for relationship. Yeah. And this notion that I can just be this autonomous person and live myself, and it's me, myself, my choices, and validate, and you can be whoever you want to be. And you don't want to be a male? Well, then you can be a female. You don't want to be? No, that's not. My comfort is that I'm not my own, but I belong to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. And that there is a sense of meaning, purpose, and belonging. And so I always say there should be no such thing as a pessimistic Christian. Sometimes I'm invited to churches and audiences, and there's a heavy mood there, and the world's out to get us, and they're persecuting us, and all the rest. Well, first of all, let's maintain a global perspective. We're among the richest people who've ever walked on the face of the earth, and compared to most people, there are Christians today who are, I think the number is roughly 13 a day die in the world for their faith.
Wow. Wow.
You and I don't know persecution.
We don't.
In a meaningful way. Does that mean I'm blind to all the trends? No. I run a think tank and I deal with religious freedom issues and all the rest every day, and euthanasia and a lot of pretty depressing and sorry things. And yet I do so as a Christian because I know that Jesus Christ died, rose again, and is the right hand of Father in heaven is coming again. I know how the story ends.
Yeah.
And, I'm basically called to an obedience in the context of that, to live in a way that by my behavior and by my words communicates the gospel. And I think that if we as a Christian church focused on doing that and living consistently, and that doesn't mean just the words we speak, but how we go about it, letting our yea be yea and our nay be nay. I don't care what objectives you pursue. If you pursue the right objectives in the wrong way, you send the wrong message.
Yeah. Alan Kreider wrote that book, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church.
Absolutely. And look at how the early church, he basically traces in that book from, how is it that a group of 120 scared people on Pentecost Sunday in an upper room, within 3 centuries, Constantine was there and became the religion of the day. Well, frankly, there was a lot of, a good number got tossed to the lions. A lot lost their jobs. The sorts of things that we complain about, they would have seen as progress.
Right. In that book, the thing that astounded me the most was, not astounded, but energized me the most was the concept of patience as a virtue. It was not a virtue to the Roman mind, but patience won the day. The people of God relying on God, kind of what you were just saying here. I know how the story ends, and so how we conduct ourselves today means everything.
And we live in a fast food economy, and we're a church that also wants an instant economy, instant results. We want instant gratification, even in our worship services. And gone is that sense of the transcendent. It's what does it mean for me? Did I get anything out of the service? Well, when you go to worship, the first question is not what did you get out of it. The first question is, did you worship God?
Yeah. Well, Ray, thank you so much. I got to say, do you have a last rebuttal?
I don't have any rebuttals. I'm just thankful for the opportunity to share. As you can tell, I occasionally get passionate about a few things, but you know what? God has given us this amazing world. I'll just leave you with one of my favorite quotes, Jonathan Edwards, and I'll put it in today's English because he spoke in 18th century long, convoluted sentences. But he's one of my favorite theologians to read. And he basically said that why did God make the world? And he said, before time began, the three persons of the Trinity had a meeting, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in which they determined God would be most glorified if the Son would have a bride. And the history of the world is this. God is gathering a bride for Christ, and he's preparing a kingdom for them to live in together forever.
Yeah, amen. That's it. That's it. And if we can keep that in mind, we are on the right track of
Absolutely.
Engaging not only our own hearts and our own friends and family, but then the public sphere and the world we're in. Ray, thank you so much for sharing your time, your passion, your energy with us, but also thank you for serving a country well and the church in Canada well. Cardus.ca, folks, I'd encourage you to go there and read and sign up for the Cardis Insights every week from Ray and read Comment Magazine. But I really appreciate that. And that gives me hope too, not only the vision you just expressed from Jonathan Edwards, but even the idea that, you know, the next generation seems to be really hungry for the relationship that God has wired into the world. And the more we're with smartphones, the more hungry we'll be.
Augustine said we have no rest until we find a rest in you.
Yeah.
And, he's echoing Romans 1 there in terms of that longing for God that is created in the heart of every man. We're not complete until we have that relationship. And as we can, that's not just true for our church and our evangelism and our relationship. That's also true for our public life. And we need to conduct ourselves in a way that our neighbors and our political enemies see. One of the practices, I found myself in the midst of some of this becoming fairly cynical. So I made it about a decade ago. I made it a practice. I consciously, at the end of every day, try to think of everybody's name who I have mentioned. And in my job, President Trump comes up most day, Prime Minister Trudeau, various of our premiers, lots of people I disagree with. And I stop for a moment to reflect on the fact that each of them is an image bearer of God, created by God, reflected. And if when I see art, if I disregard the art, I'm insulting the artist.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Ray, so much for giving of your time today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us on this great conversation. I've been encouraged and blessed, and I hope you have been too. Share this with someone like this. Go to Cardus.ca and learn more from Ray and the others there. And I look forward to seeing you the next time on Encounter Grace.
Thank you so much.